Well, I'm Elizabeth. I'm Elizabeth Russ, that's my married name, and this is about my granddad, Robert Long.
And Robert had a very interesting war. Would you like to tell us about him?
Well, he
be
joined the Royal Army Medical Corps and left England on the 14th of July 1915, and he was captured at Suvla Bay in the Dardanelles in August of that year. He was only there for about 2 weeks before he was captured, but the story that he tells in his diaries, on the day that he was captured, he says about the first couple of weeks, he says that he couldn't talk about it, that it was just too horrific what it was like there. And every day was the same. It was just wounded and bodies and blood and suffering and screaming and noise. And but on the day that he was captured, there were 10 stretchers. There were 4 men to each stretcher, and they were told at midnight the night before that they were expected to go up and retrieve the wounded from what transpired to be no man's land, because what had happened during the night is the army had gone forward. They had advanced against the Turks, but then they'd had to draw back, and so there were a lot of bodies and wounded left in no man's land, and that was where they had to go and retrieve those people, those men. And he was the 10th in line in the row of stretchers. So as they progressed, you know, the first stretcher would go up and bring someone back, and so he and his other 3 stretcher bearers ended up very close to the Turkish lines. They were just on the ridge above where they found Grandad and his, I must mention actually, his very good friend Valentine Flood, who he'd known for a long time, and who was actually one of the stretcher bearers with him, because there's sort of a bit of a story behind that. Valentine didn't make it out of the prison camps, and Grandad said that he swore that he would name his first child Valentine, and that was my mum, so she was Margaret Valentine. So anyway, he and Valentine and the other 2 found a wounded man. He had been shot through the chest and had been quickly bandaged by his colleagues before they retreated back. So they got him onto the stretcher, but there was a lot of firing going on. And he describes, actually, you'd have to read it really to get a picture of his description of the noise of the shells and the explosions and the pom-poms and all the different sounds that were going on around them, and the scattering of stones, and they were sort of trapped underneath this ridge because the Turks were firing on the English and the English were firing on the Turks. And then one of the British boats out in the harbour decided to join in and would it be mortar fire? Yes, he said that we hardly had a man on when the bullets began to whiz around us. We thought they were whizzing overhead as usual and took no notice, but when they began to strike the rocks around us, we smelt a rat and took cover. The firing continued at the lads below them, and after a minute or 2 they made another attempt, but they couldn't. But as soon as they lifted the stretcher, the bullets began to fly again. He got shot in his boot. So they decided that they and the other lads, the other 2 that were on the stretcher with him and Valentine, they made a run for it.
Successfully?
Well, as it turned out, one of them, Lacey, there's a letter from him. He did make it successfully, but a lot of them were lost. A lot of them were lost. Yeah. So he said, I took cover once again. They got down beside the wounded man, and Valentine Flood, took cover on a rock nearby, and the bullets were flying in all directions. So in a few minutes we heard voices behind the ridge, and we found the Turks had extended right down along the ridge and cut us off. And now the firing became terrific. A young fellow named there's a story about someone who tried to join them on the rocks, but he got shot in the buttock, probably from friendly fire if it was in the buttock, and it went right into his stomach and he died almost immediately. He could hear the Turks shouting and talking to one another all around, and he daren't breathe. He could hear agonised screams, people calling for a stretcher bearer, and he said I was lying on my face. Is it okay if I read this? Because it tells it better than what I could.
Read away. Yes.
I was lying flat on my face and hearing stones rattling to my left. I ventured to look out between my fingers, and to my horror I saw a Turk standing right over me. He was looking down below me, however, and aiming and firing carefully at the lads below. Everyone he'd sight, he'd cry, "English, English." The wounded man and I were in full view of him, and had I moved a finger, nothing would have saved me. He took no notice of us at all, taking us for dead, and a few seconds later he went behind the ridge again. Can you imagine the terror of that moment? You know, this is a young man of 20.
Is this the point at which he wrote that little will that you have?
I think it's a little bit later than that, actually, because he says now that he said, and now hell seemed to be less altogether. The cruiser down below started shelling the top of the ridge. She must have seen the whole performance and thought we were all wiped out, for the shells dropped only yards away, throwing up stones and clay which fell all around the wounded man and I. He had only his trousers on, and I had to keep brushing the gravel off his bare chest. He never ceased groaning all this time, and with the slightest movement his wound started to bleed. He lifted him up and got the stones off him. 6 shells in all dropped beside us, and not seeing Flood, that's Valentine, or the others at all, I gave them up for lost, as the shells dropped right in the place where they were taking cover. There was a Maxim, some kind of pom-pom, firing all the time behind the ridge. The din was deafening altogether. It's a very Irish way of saying it. A shell case went whirring down the slope. Every instant I expected to be blown to atoms, and I gave up all hope. I took out my will book and wrote my will, and put a postscript on 2 letters explaining the manner in which I met my death. Strange to say, I felt a lot better after doing that, and I pulled the wounded man under the rock out of the beating sun and gave him a drink. He was moaning all this time. It was pitiful. The cruiser had ceased firing now, and the dust gradually cleared away. The pom-pom was going on all this time, dum-dum, dum-dum, with a sickening dull sound in strange contrast with the sharp rat-tat of the machine gun. The bullets were whizzing overhead all this time. One of our Maxims was trying to find the Turks' gun. After a bit the pom-pom shifted, much to my relief, and started again further down the ridge and nearer to our trench lines. The heat of the sun told me it was midday or after. It was 4 in the morning when we were fired on first, and I'd lain all that time. And then he goes on to say the wounded man was very restless, turning and twisting all the time and continually asking for water. I thanked my stars I had a full water bottle. They had filled their water bottles up on the way up the hill. It was the first stop of the stretcher bearers made, was to fill their water bottles, and then they continued up to the trenches, to where the trenches were, to wait till daylight, because they were not allowed to, they weren't allowed to do their stretcher bearing in the dark because the terrain was so rocky and dangerous. He says too that before this that they were walking 5 miles from collecting a wounded to the hospital. It was a long way to carry men. But anyway, in this instance, he tried to cheer the wounded man up as best he could. And when darkness fell, I sat up then and tried to see if any of the others were alive. You can imagine my delight when I found Flood was all right. I thought I was altogether on my own. We had to keep silent and still, however, but we could hear the Turks talking to one another behind the ridge all the time, and several times they threw down stones, obviously to find out if there was any movement below. So everything was silent. He thought he was dead, and it was so quiet that I decided that Flood and I should make a run for it as soon as it was dark enough. But then they couldn't do that because of the wounded man, and he knew that neither Flood nor he would leave him. So they just put all their hopes in our troops making another advance that night. The patient was very restless still, and kept waving his arms about. He must have been seen from the top of the ridge, for at about 4 in the evening I heard stones rattling as if someone was coming down. I said another prayer and prepared for the end. for during our stay on the peninsula we had heard awful stories of the Turks' atrocities, mutilating the dead and wounded. And such a thing as being captured never entered our heads. Nearly there. The rattling got closer, and I looked up and saw a bayonet, about 3 feet long, pointing round the corner of the boulder. The Turk who was behind it must have signalled to the wounded man to get up, for he pointed to his wound and said he couldn't. Then I heard the Turk retiring again, and after a few minutes he returned and came round the end of the rock this time. I shall never forget the first gaze I had into a Turk's eyes. Instead of acting as I expected, he smiled and nodded at me and quietly gave me to understand by sign that there was nothing to be afraid of. He gave me a big water bottle and signed to me to give the wounded man a drink, which I did. He then took me behind the ridge and brought up Flood also. We were prisoners of war. So the rest of his diaries about his experiences as a prisoner of war, the long marches they made with a lot of wounded, other wounded people and Anzacs, all kinds of nationalities. It was a regular League of Nations really, because there were Indians and
yes,
all manner of people. And Suvla Bay, where he was captured, was just north of Anzac Cove. Yes. They had landed there to support the Anzacs, and the plan apparently was that the Anzacs would move up and they would sort of join forces.
It didn't happen that way.
No.
There's something about Suvla Bay in an old Irish song. And your grandfather was Irish, wasn't he?
He was born in Ireland.
In
yeah.
Dublin.
Yes, well, just
yes.
in a place called Tauranga, which is out of Dublin, just a little bit southwest. Well, there's a few songs that he's in the back here, the Song of the Dead, but I don't think that was particularly about Suvla Bay. This is about war in general, I think.
Oh, what a story! But he did survive. His friend Valentine.
He did survive through incredible deprivations. I mean, starvation and thirst and cold and hard labour. No, in the end, where these diaries end, which is only a bit over a year from when they started, typhoid and malaria was taking them out, and yellow fever, disease. And that's what got Valentine. Right. Grandad was very, very unwell. He talks about that. But he managed to survive it, and he kept having relapses into illness because there was no medical care to speak of. I remember when I was young, he told me that all they could do was wet the sheets, put wet sheets on them to try and take the fever down.
Yes.
But on one occasion when he awoke from his delirium, he found that Valentine had died.
Right. Goodness me. So you remember him quite well.
I do remember him well. I mean, I was only about 9 when he died, but I did spend a lot of time with him. We had a sort of rapport, he and I. I knew he smoked and Grandma didn't, you know, that sort of thing. But and I always felt like there was a special connection between he and I compared to my brother and sister. And he would often just go away, and even as a child I could sense that he had gone away, and I just would be quiet until he came back. He played the piano accordion and he played the harmonica. He was a real showman. They put on shows and they tried to keep things cheerful in the camps, and they put on concerts and what have you, and he always was a bit of a comedian. But yes, he did survive, and they were freed at the end of 1918, and within 18 months he had got married and immigrated to New Zealand.
Yes.
Which he loved. He loved this country.
Yes. So, what effect do you think the war had on him, surviving all of those deprivations and losing his best friend? And
well,
I mean, it's hard to judge when you didn't know him before the war, of course, but I just wondered what your impressions were.
Well, physically he was unwell. He was only 67 when he died. He had you know, because of the illness, because of the malaria and the typhoid, and the hard labour. Because they ended up in Ballamedic. It's one of the bigger prisoner of war camps, and he luckily didn't have to work on the railway, because that was on the tunnelling to put the railways through. That was the railway from Baghdad to, it was a very big railway, and there were 5 tunnels, but he managed not to have to do that. He instead worked on wood chopping, so they would work from dawn till at night. And the hard labour was hard on his body. Luckily he was a young man, and he was, you know, quite
obviously
fit.
quite fit and strong to survive the...
But as for psychologically, he became quite religious, and I don't know whether that was as a result of what he experienced. And I was only a child, so I don't really know, but according to my mother, he didn't talk about it much, and she often rued the fact that she hadn't actually sat down and asked him to talk about it.
But he might not have anyway,
No.
of course.
No.
Did he talk about it to you at all?
He only told me little things, like I remember once complaining because I had to drink milk instead of, I don't know, something else, and he said that when he remembered it being so hot and then being so exhausted. They marched for 100 kilometres at times, under guard. And I can remember him telling me that the muddiest puddle would taste better than lemonade. And I just really remember that, because I thought, whoa, I've never looked at muddy puddles in quite the same way since then. But no, he didn't really talk. No, he didn't. I don't think he could put it into words what he went through.
Well, he could obviously write it down, so it's
Yes.
a good thing that the diaries survived as much as
He
they
didn't start writing it immediately. He couldn't. You know, it was they were being moved from pillar to post. On the 19th of February 1916, he says that he's been over 6 months a prisoner of war, and I think it would be advisable to put down the principal events while they're comparatively fresh in my memory. So that was when he looked back to the day on 17th of August, and went forward to that. Yeah.
This is one of the most remarkable stories we've heard.
Is it?
Yes, it's remarkable.
Well, it's little known. That event is little known. This magazine did an article, I think it's an English one, and my granddad's son, my Uncle Bob, he must have sent them some information. It's called Battlefields Review, and they said it wasn't reported or anything. It was sort of hushed up, because the man that gave the command for them to proceed right up to the Turkish line was advised, when they got up to the trenches, the men in the trenches said, don't do it. It's suicide. Don't go any further. But the granddad's commanding officer told them to do it.
Told them to do it. And also he had this obvious deep sense of commitment to the wounded man. Once you've committed yourself to taking care of that wounded man, you're not going to leave him. So once they were there, they were there.
Yes, that's right. But in fact, he doesn't know what happened to the wounded man. He was left. He says at one point, perhaps the Turks put him out of his misery. He had he was shot on the chest, so, but he doesn't know, obviously he had no control over that.
No,
yeah.
none at all.
Mm.
No. Oh, well, that's a remarkable story, Elizabeth. Is there anything else you would like to say about your grandfather?
I have very fond memories of him. He was a character, and he used to spend hours talking to me about the bees. He was fascinated with how bees, the whole community worked in bee land, and about cows' stomachs, how they made grass into milk. He always had time.
Yes.
He always had time, but he had a little clinker dinghy that he used to go fishing in. And he always went by himself. And I can remember going with him and him telling me I wasn't allowed to talk because it would frighten the fish. But I think he just wanted to put me off going with him again. I felt a lot of love from him. He taught me how to pay patience, and he read stories, and he was a very quiet, gentle sort of man.
Did he have an Irish accent?
He had an Irish accent for sure.
Yeah.
And when he came to he absolutely loved New Zealand, and he and Grandma settled in Waira on Hawke's Bay because some of his prison, you wouldn't call them colleagues, the other prisoners had moved to New Zealand, and some were New Zealanders and Australians, and they had encouraged him to come out here for a new start, which I dare say he would have wanted after that horror. But he learnt to speak te reo too. He loved the Māori people. Yeah, that's what I remember of him. Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming in and telling us
Oh,
about
you're
it.
welcome.
It's
You're welcome.
a wonderful story. Thank you.